All right. We finished last week with the Suez Canal crisis. So we're going to pick up from there. I just want to get up to speed. We'll spend a couple minutes on what we covered last week. We talked about the rise of Islam. This new religion pops up in the 600s uh, by a man by the name of Muhammad. He starts receiving divine revelations in 610, and by 630, this religion by this man named Muhammad rises. They conquer an area called Mecca, which is about 770 miles south of Jerusalem. And then by 638, this new religion has conquered Jerusalem. By 690, the Dome of the Rock, which we'll touch on some more this week, was built. And as we discussed last week, the Dome of the Rock, you got me? The Dome of the Rock is built on top of the temple, the first and the second temple. And we covered some verses last week on what we think is going to end up happening to that Dome of the Rock. And I'm sure Clint and Brother Freddie will cover that too in a couple of weeks. By 690, Islam's the dominant religion in the entire area. And basically, Christians are basically driven out of the area. Then we talk about the First Crusades. There is a brief window there where a couple of the people we talked about last week, Peter the Hermit and Walter the Penniless, and a group of really kind of poor Christians come in and retake Jerusalem in 1099. And Jerusalem is actually recognized almost as a state for about an 88-year period until it's conquered again. We then covered a little bit about the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire was kind of the dominant world empire for about a 400-year period. And as part of that, they take over Palestine and Jerusalem. Now, the Ottoman Empire is from Turkey, and it's a Muslim-based religion. So again, it's a time of Jerusalem and the Christians basically being taken out of their land. Then we covered the Zionist movement. We talked about the book called The Jewish State that was written in 1896, where a Jewish attorney and philosopher writes a book that basically calls for Zionism, and that's where the term kind of took foothold, was in the 1890s, where he calls for the Jews to move back into the area of Israel and to form the Jewish state. World War I breaks out in 1914. One of the parties was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is conquered along with Germany, and the area where Israel is at is taken over by Britain. Britain is in charge of determining what they're going to do with this land. So in 1917, they issue what was called the Balfour Declaration, which was a man by the name of Arthur Balfour issues a declaration on behalf of the British government saying, we intend to aid in the creation of the Israel nation. The British Mandate comes out, where Britain is basically charged with being told what to do with this land, and it's further support for they're going to use this land to create the Jewish state. Then we talked about where some of Britain's position, they kind of backtrack a little bit in the late 30s with the Peel Partition and the White Papers. The Peel Partition was a commission that was done by a British authority, and he goes around and basically, for all intents and purposes, interviews a bunch of people and basically says, these people aren't going to get along, we need a second state. 2 years later, the White Papers come out, and Britain takes the position of Palestine needs a state within 10 years. Brother Jack and I were talking about it last week, and he made a good point. He said that's kind of the beginning of the end of the British dynasty, when they kind of went against supporting Israel as a nation there in the late 1930s. Then we talked about the founding of the nation. By 1947, Britain kind of threw its hands up and said, we can't deal with this conflict anymore between the Palestinians and the Jews that are here. They turn it over to the United Nations. The United Nations passes a resolution that basically says we intend to form two separate states. Israel took that to mean we're going to form our own state. And then on May 14th of 1948, Israel declares itself a nation. And we covered the prophetical verses and kind of the history of that last week. The next day, the 5 surrounding Arab nations attack Israel and what's been called the War of Independence. So we kind of talked about, the celebration for the nation didn't last long. We also covered where President Truman was the first world political leader to voice his support and recognition of the nation. We'll cover a lot more today, the different presidents and how we've consistently supported Israel. We discussed a little bit about the nation building, the law of return, where Israel passed a law in 1950 that says anybody that's a Jew, whether by religion or by birth, by having a mother or father that's a Jew, you can move here and get automatic citizenship. So that increased the strength of the nation. We also talked about the importance of military duty, where in Israel, every man and every woman is required to be in the military. And we talked about the benefits of basically building that unity with the people, because you've got people coming from really all over the world to form this new nation. We finished with the Suez Canal crisis. This is where Egypt closes up the canal. That was basically a major lane of transport in the region. It led to what could have been another major outbreak of war. It ended up getting resolved. So we'll pick up this week with the 1960s. We'll pick up with the 6-Day War. And this is probably the most important war in the history of Israel since it became a nation. Let's walk through it a little bit. By 1966, tensions between Israel and all of the surrounding nations have basically reached a boiling point. President Nasser, he is the president of Egypt. We know Egypt is directly south of Israel. He was being pressured by the other surrounding nations, by Lebanon and by Syria and by Saudi Arabia, to basically adopt what they called a warlike anti-Israel rhetoric. So in order to kind of prove his goods to these other nations, he starts taking these different actions. He closes the Straits of Tiran, and I know it's small. I put that on the map, but you can see that that's a major passageway. It's a little strip of water that allows Israel to access the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and then the Far East. So President Nasser, his first act is that he closes up the strait and basically stops movement of ships from Israel. He then goes and makes a public announcement that he says he demands that Israel gives back all of its land that it formed its nation with. The next day, King Hussein of Jordan, who is directly to the east of Israel, enters into a treaty with Egypt to basically kind of lock arms with him. So then in the summer of 1967, the 5 surrounding nations ramp up their presence, and they said by June of 1967, 500,000 Arab troops are positioned along the border of Israel, all the way around it. So Israel is on the eve of being attacked and basically being overtaken, and this is seen by the actions of these countries, where they're basically releasing information. They intend to just destroy the nation of Israel 19 years after it's come into effect. Israel, instead of waiting for the attack, kind of flips the cards on all these nations. Early on the morning of June the 5th, 1967, Israel carried out an airstrike that wiped out nearly all of the air support for Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. They said by lunchtime that day, 90% of the planes of these neighboring nations were destroyed. So they completely controlled the airspace. Within 6 days, Egypt had conquered, I think I may have this on a slide. I think I do. Here's a picture I thought was good. That's the Egyptian airfield, a picture taken the afternoon of June the 5th. Those are going to be hard to fly. Yeah. You've got a little bit of a wing left, and that's about it. So within 6 days, Israel has taken the Sinai Peninsula, which is, if you look at the map on the right, it's that light blue area. They've overtaken that from Egypt. They have taken the Gaza Strip from Egypt. They've taken the West Bank from Jordan, and they've taken the Golan Heights from Syria. So within 6 days, basically they increased their land by about 3 times. give or take. So, so instead of being attacked and overtaken within 6 days, they have tripled the amount of land that they consider Israel. So the aftermath, there's really four main points I want to cover here. One is the land it controls. We just covered that, and you see the two differing maps. The second is the issue of the refugees. So you had a lot of Palestinians that were in the West Bank and that were living in Gaza. Well, once they were overtaken by Israel, the Palestinians decided that obviously they weren't going to stay in this area that now basically was part of the nation of Israel. So, according to my reading, about 250,000 Palestinians fled from the West Bank, which is up in the middle, and then Gaza down in the corner. So they fled, and these refugees fled mainly to Jordan, which is directly to the east. Now, around this time, this leader, and we're going to cover him in depth in a minute, by the name of Yasser Arafat, pops up. And he gathers all of these refugees and starts basically building, the group is called Fatah, F-A-T-A-H, but it's a group where he basically builds up this group, and he basically leads a group and says it's time for a popular liberation war. So he basically says once the refugees are taken out of the country, that they need to attack back. So they're in 1967. Arafat and all these refugees who become militants then attack to take back the West Bank and Gaza. From everything I read, these attacks were a complete failure. It says that hundreds of Fatah guerrilla soldiers were killed, thousands were captured. It says Arafat was forced to withdraw his remaining fighters to Jordan. But does Arafat kind of learn his lesson and tuck his tail and go away? We'll see soon that that's not the case at all. So this initial attack is unsuccessful, but it says in the first 3 months of 1968, so about 9 months after the 6-day war, Arafat's people carry out 78 different attacks on Israelis. So almost daily, they're attacking Israel in some way. So a couple other points worth noting after the 6-day war. Here's a picture. That's Yitzhak Rabin. Yitzhak Rabin was born in 1922. He joins the Israeli military at 19 years old, and by 1948, he's only 26 years old, but he's one of the top commanders in the War of Independence that we just talked about. So he was a key military official when Israel gained its independence and became a state. In 1964, he's appointed the chief of staff for the Israeli Defense Force, and that's their military. So he was the commander of the Israeli military during the 6-day war. Here, this picture here is on June 22nd of 1967, and it's former Vice President and future President Richard Nixon goes to meet with Commander Rabin. As we'll discuss in a minute, Nixon has fully supported Israel through several actions, but here he is meeting with Rabin. I thought it was a good picture to kind of show two world leaders that are going to really figure prominently in the next couple decades. I just write both men's careers will take a dramatic turn. Nixon wins the election in about a year. Of course, we know what happens. He ends up resigning in 1974. And then we're going to talk about in a little bit what happened to Rabin's career. It wasn't quite as successful by the end. But anyway, the point I wanted to make is they had to come up with a name for this war. And I thought this was interesting. It says, in recognition of contributions, Rabin was given the honor of naming the war for the Israelis. From the suggestions proposed, including the War of Daring, the War of Salvation, the War of Sons of Light, it says Rabin chose the least ostentatious, the 6-day war, evoking the days of creation. And I thought it was interesting that he, in some of his speeches, he talked about how Israel created itself over 6 days, and that's why he came up with that name. The last point is the U.S. support. U.S. began really financially supporting Israel after this point, and they said that beginning in 1967, that it dramatically increased its financial support, where it was providing up to $2 billion a year to Israel during this time. About 40% of this was economic, 60% of it became in the form of military equipment. Okay, so again, we'll go back to just the West Bank. So I want to cover a little bit about the West Bank. This is the area, one of the areas that was conquered during the Six-Day Wars. Just some information so we have a better understanding about this area. The West Bank there is 3,641 square miles. Remember, if you recall, Israel is about 8,600. So the West Bank is about 42% of Israel in land once they took that over. After the Six-Day War, Israel began, instead of calling it the West Bank, they started calling the area Judea and Samaria, or the Judea and Samaria region. In 1977, the new prime minister, Begin, he was elected. He was the sixth prime minister, and Begin was a proponent of expansion. As we'll see, a lot of future prime ministers are willing to give up land for peace. Prime Minister Begin, when he comes in and says, this is our land, we're considering it part of the nation. So he really pushes for this land to now be called Judea and Samaria instead of the West Bank. And of course, we know the importance of Judea and Samaria. Judea is the southern area, anything south of the city of Jerusalem. Samaria is anything north of the city of Jerusalem. Samaria in the Bible, were some instances where Samaria is discussed in the Bible. This is this same area generally. It's a little different, but I got looking at maps, but this Samaria and Judea are pretty close to the same area as the Samaria and Judea in the Bible. So a few instances. The Israelites captured Samaria. The Old Testament talks about from the Canaanites when they come to reconquer the land. Samaria was in the northern kingdom and was the capital city of the northern kingdom. It says the name of Samaria likely began being used for the entire northern kingdom. So not only was it a city, it was also basically kind of the northern kingdom. I didn't know of an example. I thought about New York. You got New York City, New York State. Samaria mentioned in the Bible. In Luke 17, Jesus heals the 10 lepers in Samaria. In John 4, Jesus goes to Samaria and he meets a woman of Samaria. The woman says she doesn't have a husband, and he reminds her that you actually have 5 husbands, including not the current one. So there's some pretty eventful stuff that took place in that region. And then lastly, in John 4, it says that Jesus cometh he to a city of Samaria. And then in Acts 1, it says they were scattered throughout the region abroad, throughout the region of Judea and Samaria. So Samaria, even in the Bible times, was both a city, but it was also a region. So a little background there on Samaria. Okay, so the rise of terrorism and the Munich massacre. After the Six-Day War, the terrorism and the attacks on Israel increases dramatically. In December of 1968, a Palestinian terrorist group hijacks an Israeli passenger plane and kills some of the people. Over the next 3 years, from 1968 through 71, there are numerous, I couldn't even go through all the events, but the Palestinian terrorists are hijacking planes, kidnapping citizens of Israel, they're bombing Israeli lands, and it kind of leads to this apex of this event, of this picture. I'm sure all of us have probably seen this picture, so we'll go through what this picture is. Before this happened, King Hussein, who is the king of Jordan, who we know is directly to the east of Israel, he has all these, Arafat and his PLO group has moved into Jordan. Well, King Hussein has a little bit of sense and says, you've got to cut out the terrorist acts because Israel is going to attack us. So in 1971, King Hussein orders the PLO and Arafat to follow his orders. In other words, you're in my country, you're subject to my rule and my commands. Well, it says within the same month that he issued this demand to PLO, it says the Palestinian terrorist group hijacked 3 additional planes, took the planes to an airport in Jordan, and held passengers hostage. It says the group demanded that Palestinian fighters that had been jailed released. The passengers were released. The planes were blown up. In other words, Arafat and his group completely ignore King Hussein. They come into his country and are basically using it to funnel all their terrorist acts. So Jordan and King Hussein expels the PLO through some military action, and the PLO has to move from Jordan to Syria up north. Okay, so that's where we're at in 1972. So 1972, the Summer Olympics are in Munich, Germany. The last time the Olympics were in Germany was in 1936. And when you look back at that event, that was really kind of the coming out party of Adolf Hitler in 1936, where he used the entire Olympics as basically propaganda against the Jews. So this is a big international event for Germany to kind of restore itself and prove itself that it's kind of washed its hands of the Holocaust and all the events of the 30s and 40s. So there's a whole story. You could teach a whole lesson on this Munich massacre, as it's called. But there is bunks for the Olympic athletes, and each Olympic nation has kind of dorms, I guess you would call it. I think it was dorms. And so there would be a wing for the Israeli athletes and so forth. On the morning of September the 5th, 1972, at 4:10 a.m., the only security they said there was basically a fence, a 6-foot fence. And it's been questioned, and they said basically there was already threats that these terrorists were going to come after the Israelis, but Germany didn't really do much about it. Regardless, on the morning of September the 5th of 1972, 8 members of this Palestinian terrorist group that's tied in with the PLO called the Black September takes 11 members of this Israeli Olympic team hostage. During the initial skirmish, 2 of the Israeli weightlifters, one attacks a couple of the, by the name of Yosef Romano. Yosef Romano was a power lifter. Not only that, he fought in the 6-Day War on behalf of Israel. He attacked the intruders back. They shot and killed him. After he got shot and killed, an Olympic wrestler by the name of Gad Tayabari knocks one of the terrorists unconscious. They then take him and shoot and kill him. So there's 9 hostages left. Why did this Black September PLO group do this? Their reasoning is because 2 Palestinian villages were expelled by Israel during the 48 Palestinian War. In other words, they're getting back at Israel for the conflict during the War of Independence. Okay, so once they had these hostages, these guys started coming out. This was broadcast on the national news. It was there's some really interesting footage where it was covered nightly. And in fact, I thought this was interesting. The Olympics went on for a little bit, and then the national or the international state says you have to stop the Olympics. So they were literally just going to go on while this hostage situation was going on. So anyway, these guys start coming out with these masks. They're making demands. So the demand they end up making that same day is they demand for 328 prisoners being held in Israel to be released in exchange for the 9 Israeli Olympic athletes. Israel's response is, we don't negotiate with terrorists. So the next day, and when I first saw this, I thought this was a long carried out thing. All of this happened within a 24-hour period. They try to bait these terrorists to get on a helicopter. They're trying to bait them so some German snipers can kill the terrorist. The entire rescue attempt completely fails. All 9 of the Israeli Olympic athletes that were hostages are killed. 5 of the Palestinian attackers are killed as well. 3 escape. And this is worth reading. It says, the bodies of the 5 Palestinian attackers were delivered to Libya, where they received heroes' funerals and were buried with full military honors. So this is, instead of their country condemning the action they took, we see that it was fully supported, what they did here at the Olympic Village. 2 days later, Israeli planes bombed 10 PLO bases. Says it kills a reported 200 militants. Israel called it the Operation Wrath of God. And I wanted to read this. The military leader who was over this, somebody said that it wasn't an equal reaction to the acts of these 8 terrorists. The Israeli general says, we had no choice. We had to make them stop, and there was no other way. We are not very proud about it, but it was a question of sheer necessity. Later he says, if I'm very hard-headed, I can say, what is the political benefit in killing this person? Will it bring us nearer to peace? Will it bring us nearer to an understanding with the Palestinians or not? In most cases, I don't think it will. But in the case of Black September, we had no other choice and it worked. Is it morally acceptable? One can debate that question. Is it politically vital? It was. And we've talked about that in a couple of weeks. Israel's response is always probably more than what it should be. But when you understand that you have an entire world around them that's attacking them, they don't normally respond in kind. They respond in kind plus more. The next year, there is another major war called the Yom Kippur War. Am I saying that right? Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur is the holiest day for Jews. This is a day where the entire nation prays. It talks about on this day of October the 6th, 1973, Yom Kippur in that year, that basically the entire nation was praying. Says that this is a day centered around atonement and repentance, and it's observed with fasting throughout the day and an extended prayer service. So on this day, all of Israel is praying. It says including the Israeli soldiers. That day, Egypt and Syria attack Israel simultaneously. So you've got Egypt attacking from the south, you have Syria attacking from the east. It says less than 500 Israeli soldiers faced 600,000 Egyptian soldiers when the war initially broke out. It says in the north, 180 Israeli tanks were called on to defend 1,400 Syrian tanks that entered into the nation of Israel. 6 days later, President Richard Nixon authorizes a massive emergency airlift and provides weapons and ammunitions to Israel to help in the war. 18 days later, Egypt and Syria asked for a ceasefire rather than having to give up further land. So this is a skirmish that lasted for 18 days, caught Israel completely by surprise, and a lot of the stuff you read where the Israel historians are saying, we were so unprepared. And this war is compared to the Hamas attack of October 2023, where they kind of got caught, rightfully so. It's a day of worship, but they got caught and they were attacked. So, all right. So next we'll jump ahead about 5 years to the Camp David Accords. Jimmy Carter becomes president of the United States in January of 1977, and one of his big platforms was rejuvenating peace talks in the Middle East. Of course, we know that nothing is ever really settled there in the 70s. We just covered some of the events. So recall in 1967, the Sinai Peninsula, part of Egypt, was taken over in the Six-Day War. So that is Israel's land as of the Camp David Accords here in 1978. So Anwar Sadat, who is pictured on the left, was the leader of Egypt. He reaches out to Israel's Knesset, and remember, Knesset is basically their government. He reaches out to them in 1978, and he wants to meet to discuss a peace treaty. Israel has a new prime minister, Menachem Begin, who we talked about just briefly. He agrees to meet with him. In September of 1978, in order to kind of, I guess, put it down in writing or solidify the agreement, Sadat and Begin both go to Camp David here in the United States, and they spend 13 days at Camp David. There's some interesting facts about these negotiations. They said that Begin hated Sadat so bad he refused to be in the same room with them. So there were cabins on this land, and they said that Begin and his people were in a cabin. Sadat was on the land. I'm sorry. What was his name? What was the Egyptian guy's name? Yeah, Sadat. Yeah, Sadat was, and Jimmy Carter, they said, literally was walking from cabin to cabin because Begin and Israel refused to even be in the same room with them. So Carter was interested in what's become known as a land for peace agreement. And the agreement was basically, Israel, you give up the Sinai Peninsula, and then Egypt will quit attacking you. So in order to help it, I thought this was interesting. Jimmy Carter takes the two groups to the Gettysburg National Military Park, shows them the history of the Civil War, and I thought that was just an interesting. They took these two world leaders basically on a field trip. So the parties reach an agreement. There's two main parts to it. One, as to the West Bank, Israel is going to let the Palestinians start kind of ruling the West Bank or making decisions and self-govern the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And then importantly, Egypt was willing to withdraw all of its forces from the Sinai Peninsula. Israel had built 4 air bases since the Six-Day War. They were willing to give all that back to Egypt. They were going to evacuate all of their military, all their inhabitants. And then Egypt was going to allow free passage on the Suez Canal that we talked about and the Straits of Tiran. So anyway, they basically reached an agreement where we'll cooperate with each other. We'll give you all this land back. You can take whatever we built. So that ended up being basically the major terms of the Camp David Accords. Because of this, Egypt is castrated from the Arab League. They were cut out of that for a 10-year period where they said, you don't negotiate with them. You try to destroy them. So Egypt caught it pretty hard. 3 years later, on October the 6th of 1981, President Sadat, the Egyptian leader, is assassinated by an Islamic jihad. They were holding a victory parade in Cairo, Egypt, and he's assassinated. And they said it was because of him negotiating with Israel. Camp David Accords and the Land for Peace Deal, Joel 3:2. Joel 3:2 says, I will also gather all nations. This is prophetical, but it talks about wanting to give away Israel's land. It says, and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom that they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. So the biggest problem people have with Carter was a lot of people see him as a great negotiator, and he reached some peace in the area for a short term, but his position was made clear in this book that I pictured, this Palestine Peace, Not Apartheid. He writes a book in 2006, and he says there are 2 interrelated obstacles to permanent peace. The first and major obstacle is Israel's, quote, belief they have the right to confiscate and colonize Palestinian land. So he kind of shows his cards there where he's interested in peace, but he's almost taken the position of Israel, you've done these people wrong by taking that land there. In December of 2024, last month, the United Nations held a vote that would require Israel to cease settlement activities from occupied Palestine. And so this position has continued. 157 nations voted in favor. Only 8 voted against. One of the nations that voted against that was the United States. Yep. Okay. The Lebanon War. So more wars. I know these things kind of, it's one war after another, but Lebanon is the country directly north of Israel. So during the 70s and 80s, as we talked about, Yasser Arafat gets kicked out of Jordan, so he has to move his entire operation up to Beirut, Lebanon. I've got a picture of Beirut right there on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Beirut is 80 miles from Israel's border, so it's not very far. It's a mountainous region, so if you drive there, it's actually about 180 miles, but it's straight shot. You're only about 80 miles up the coast to get to Beirut. So from July of 81 through June of 82, in an 11-month period, it says the PLO carried out 270 attacks into Israel. So you're talking about an attack a day from the PLO out of Lebanon. So the breaking point was this. Gunmen in June of 1982 attempt to assassinate Israel's ambassador. So in June, and I want to look at this, Brother Jack, you may know some of this. It's amazing how much stuff has happened in early June. Yeah. All these events keep happening in June 5th, June 6th. There's probably something more to it. But June 6th is important to America. It wasn't 38 years from D-Day. Yeah. anyway, it's interesting that I thought about this looking at it. Anyway, so June 6th of 1982, Israel sends soldiers. They cross the line up into Lebanon to drive PLO out because of the attacks. Israel calls this Operation Peace for Galilee. Israel's army is joined with the Christian Lebanese forces and the South Lebanese army. So this isn't just Israel. Even Lebanon says, we've got to get these terrorists out of our country. There's a faction there. So they go up and they overtake Beirut, which is the capital of Lebanon. President Reagan, I was going to do the clip, but there's a speech where he publicly supports Israel's right to defend itself and for entering into Lebanon there. So Arafat and his people get kicked out of Lebanon, and we'll show you a slide in a minute. So this little tribe goes from Jordan, they get kicked, they go to Lebanon. So we'll talk about where they're going to go in a minute. So they get kicked out of Lebanon. The picture I have is a guy named Bakir Gemayel. He was part of the Lebanese Christian forces who fought with Israel. He's elected president once they overthrow the PLO on August 23rd of 1982. 22 days later, September 14th of 1982, he's assassinated. So politics in the Middle East is a dangerous business. By May of 1983, Israel pulls out of Beirut. But anyway, so that was another big dust-up that happened there in the 80s. That was a picture once Israel had overtaken Beirut. I thought it was an interesting picture. This is Israeli soldiers in Lebanon taken in 1982. All right, so more fighting. By 1987, it says Palestinian has grown increasingly upset about Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Listen to that again. The Palestinians are mad that Israel is in the West Bank and Gaza. Me and Marley play a game called Manhattan. It's a board game. And what you do is you just stack up and you try to conquer little territories or little towns. And so I'll try to get my little towns. You get points for having certain towns. And you can conquer and overtake towns by placing your buildings on top of your opponent's buildings. It's just kind of similar to Risk, but you're building it up. So Marley will come into my territory and start trying to overtake my buildings. So I just always counter, and I'd start overtaking all of her lands, and she gets mad at me. And I'm like, well, but once you come into my land, I'm then going to attack your land. The point is the Palestinians are so mad that Israel is in the West Bank and in Gaza, but they're the one that started the entire conflict. They brought all this on with the Six-Day War. So 20 years after the Six-Day War, this leads to what's called the First Intifada. Intifada is an Arabic word that means uprising or shaking off. It's obviously, in this context, they're trying to shake off Israel. They feel like they've done them wrong by being in their land. So what starts this up is from 1984 up to 1987, Israel's population in the West Bank, which the Palestinians view as theirs, has increased from 35,000 to 64,000. So you've almost doubled the Jews that are living in the West Bank. A major event happens in December of 1987. There's a refuge camp, that Jabalia refuge camp. Not that the location's that important, but just to kind of give you an idea of where it's at up there. There is an Israeli truck that collides with 4 Palestinian workers, and 3 of them got killed. So this led to these major riots where Palestinians believe the attack was intentional. What happened is 2 days before this, there was a businessman, an Israeli businessman shopping in Gaza. He gets stabbed to death. So they're thinking, I'm going to read a couple newspaper articles that's kind of interesting. Anyway, so Palestinians in 1987, after this event where the truck runs in and kills the 3 people, they start throwing stones, Molotov cocktails. They start doing strikes, boycotts. They refuse to pay taxes. So basically it's not really a war, but there's just all this fighting and skirmishes and terrorist stuff that's going on for this 6-year period. Israel responds. They shut down schools in the West Bank. There was a Hebron University, which was the major university there. Israel says no school for the next 4, I guess Zayd and Matthew would like that. But they shut the college down. They shut the schools down. And then they started placing curfews on the Palestinians. So in other words, Palestinian ramped it up, and then Israel ramped it up, and they just ramped this up to where for 6 years it turned into this where they were just kind of matching each other by ramping up the acts against each other. All right, who was to blame? I want to read these two articles that were written. And listen, this is the exact same story that's written from two different perspectives. The Middle East Monitor, this is a pro-Hamas paper. Here's what they wrote. After hundreds of Palestinians witnessed the killing of 4 men when they were run down by an Israeli jeep outside Jabalah refugee camp in Gaza on December 8th, the indignation felt at their situation was immense. The funerals of those killed were attended by 10,000 people, but they were forced to mourn once again the following day when Israeli troops fired aimlessly into a crowd, killing a 17-year-old and wounding 16 others. So let's see the Jewish Virtual Library, which was a Jewish paper during that time. And here's what they wrote about the exact same incident. False charges of Israeli atrocities and instigation from the mosque played an important role in starting the Intifada. On December 6, 1987, an Israeli was stabbed to death while shopping in Gaza. One day later, 4 residents of the Jabalah refugee camp in Gaza were killed in a traffic accident. It was either an accident or an act of Israel. I'm not sure which one, but a little bit different reporting. Rumors that the 4 had been killed by Israelis as a deliberate act of revenge began to spread among the Palestinians. Remember, they just said that this 17-year-old was just shot in cold blood. Mass rioting broke out in Jabalah on the morning of December 9th, in which a 17-year-old youth was killed by an Israeli soldier after throwing a Molotov cocktail at an army patrol. So I don't know if it was just a 17-year-old that got killed or he was a 17-year-old that was trying to kill the soldiers. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the PLO. We've touched on that a little bit. The picture here is in 1988, the PLO adopts the Palestinian flag. The PLO basically becomes the voice of the Palestinians. The PLO was started in 1964 in Egypt. Their organization established the advocacy of, quote, the elimination of the nation of Israel. Pretty straightforward on what these people were created for. Their first major attack was in 1965. Israel has what's called a national water carrier, and in simple terms, there's an issue with getting water from the north part of the nation to the south part, and they built this very intricate system to basically transport water throughout the nation. In January of 1965, it's attacked by the PLO and basically shuts the water supply off to the nation. So in how many letters, what's the longest word you know? That was what I thought. So supercalifragilisticexpialidocious has 34 letters in it. I looked that up. I've got something that can top it. In 1969, someone is named the chairman of the PLO, who will lead the PLO. His name, Mohammed Abdel Rahman Abdel Rauf Arafat al-Qadda al-Husseini. 52 letters. Became to be known as Yasser Arafat. So he takes over. Obviously, he's already done some stuff, but he becomes the actual recognized leader of the PLO in 1969. By 1970s that we discussed, there's multiple terrorist acts, including the Munich massacre that we discussed. In 74, the future Prime Minister, Begin, says, quote, I'll never negotiate with the PLO, even if the PLO recognizes Israel as a state. So we talked about during the Lebanese War, the PLO is ousted from Beirut, and so I put where they had to move to. So they move over here to Africa, to Tunisia. So they've gone from Jordan, they get kicked out of there, they then get removed in the Lebanon War, and now they're over here in Tunisia. And they moved to Tunisia in 1982. Okay, so what I have a picture there is that was a bombing with children on it, the PLO, and there's hundreds and hundreds. This just gives an example. There was a busload of children that the PLO bombed and killed all the children on board. So just one example of many is, and it's no secret that's what their entire Yeah, their entire purpose was basically just to create terror in Israel. So this leads us to the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords was in 1993. This is in Oslo, Norway. Israel and PLO began negotiating. Now, this in itself is a miracle because the PLO's stated purpose is to destroy Israel. In September of 1993, on September the 13th, the parties signed what's called the Oslo Accord at the White House. The prime minister for Israel is Yitzhak Rabin, or R-A-B-I-N. I think we've talked about him before. And then Yasser Arafat for the PLO. What's the importance of this agreement? This is the first signed peace agreement between a Palestinian organization and Israel since Israel became a nation. So that's the importance of it. So as part of the agreement, there's three main points that I bulleted here. The Palestinians agree to recognize Israel as a nation. Israel agrees to recognize PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. Two, Israel agrees to withdraw from Gaza. Israel would pass responsibility for certain matters, including education, health, on to the PLO. So in other words, they're going to recognize each other, we're going to quit fighting with each other, and all will end well. Before I play this video, this is a famous video here. This is on the afternoon of September the 13th, 1993. President Clinton has got Prime Minister Rabin and Yasser Arafat together on the front lawn of the White House to basically have the world recognize this historic agreement. I want you to watch Prime Minister Rabin's body language during this. Rabin, during these negotiations, even at the White House, was calling Arafat a terrorist. So if you think that everybody was on board with this agreement, Israel really wasn't. In fact, it said that Rabin initially refused to even appear at the White House because he didn't want to appear with Arafat. So after signing the agreement, they come outside and they said that according to what I read, President Clinton didn't even tell Prime Minister Rabin what he was going to do. Once he gets him out here, he whispers to either Rabin or I don't know how, if he translated or whatever, but he said, I want you to shake hands with Arafat. And Rabin says, I'm not shaking this man's hand. And Clinton says, well, it's kind of part of the agreement. That's what we're going to do. So let me make sure I don't guess you really have to hear it. So he nudges them together. A couple things I want you to notice about this handshake. He's hesitant when Arafat goes over to shake the Knesset, the other leaders. Rabin shakes his head like this is not what we agreed to. The other important thing is Rabin never initiates another handshake. So Arafat is, shaking hands with everybody. Rabin shaking his head, and he refuses to shake anybody else's hand. So you got Rabin there on the left. Watch Rabin when Arafat reaches out to start shaking their hands. I think we can go maybe one more slide. Oslo 2. So 2 years later, there's another agreement with President Clinton, Prime Minister Rabin, and Arafat. This, again, was trying to help the relations between Israel and the PLO and the Palestinians. There's really 5 main points to this one. And you see it's kind of just a recurring theme where they're trying to pass off power, but they just can't get it together. There was 5 chapters to this agreement. The first chapter is Israel is going to transfer some of the power to Palestine as they've tried to do before. That's the top picture. And that they were going to give that in the West Bank. Chapter 2, Israel is willing to basically redeploy all the security forces in West Bank and in Gaza. And that's the picture of the military guy. Legal affairs was chapter 3. And it basically, they lay out a framework where if they have disputes, they can actually resolve it instead of bombing and killing each other. We'll see how that turns out later. Yeah. Chapter 4 is a cooperation agreement. That's my handshake slide. It says the two groups agree to, quote, abstain from incitement, including hostile propaganda. That doesn't last long. chapter 5 is had miscellaneous provisions. The main part was safe passage, in which Israel agreed to help the Palestinians move from West Bank to Gaza freely, and then also from Jordan up Jordan to Egypt. So anyway, I guess just in other words, if they're traveling through Israel, basically they were going to work out some type of kind of transportation agreements as to that. The last point that I'll make is there was also another thing where they basically divided up the area where Israel agreed to give a small portion of the West Bank where the Palestinian Authority had full autonomy. They controlled the military, they controlled political, they controlled everything. They gave them 3% of that. And then they were also going to agree to like kind of step away in other areas. How did the countries think about this? The Palestinians were not happy about this because they felt like they didn't get enough. And even Israel, the Knesset ratified this agreement by only one vote. Many Israelis, including Benjamin Netanyahu, who we're going to do an entire slide on, strongly opposed the withdrawal because Netanyahu's position was as soon as we withdraw, it leads to terrorist encampments, which leads to more attacks. So we can't trust these people over the last 40 years. If we withdraw, and of course, you can imagine where the next slides are going to go. Next slides, we'll talk about, I didn't get to what I want to get to. We're going to talk about that guy next week, Far 4. It's like a Mickey Mouse character. That's pretty interesting. And then the last week, we're going to discuss the Holocaust, Trump and modern day Israel. 2 minutes. I want to read this. This came out 2 o'clock this morning. If you want some up-to-date information. You know, Hamas and Israel is in the middle of giving hostages back and forth to each other. The guy that we talked about, the U.S. citizen who also had Israeli citizenship, who's had his wife and 2 children in the bunker, he did get released last weekend. He was released a week ago. Anyway, this is the news that came out from the Associated Press at 1:38 a.m. Israel said on Sunday it was delaying the release of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners it had planned to free the day before until militant group Hamas met its conditions. Prime Minister Netanyahu's office released a statement in the early hours of Sunday saying that Israel was waiting to deliver the 620 Palestinian prisoners and detainees, quote, until the release of the next hostages has been assured and without the humiliating ceremonies. Now, listen to this. That was a reference to recent handovers by Hamas that UN officials have said went against international law because they were not respectful. Hamas has made hostages appear on stage in front of crowds and sometimes speak before they were handed over. Coffins with hostage remains have been carried throughout the crowds. And so, in other words, Netanyahu says, this isn't a prisoner exchange. You're using our people as dummies to mock us. So that was the latest release from Prime Minister Netanyahu as of about 6 or 7 hours ago. So, okay. We'll pick back up, I don't know when, next week or two.